Guys, before we get started, can I just say something that's been on my mind all night? It is so weird to be here. It's so strange that 150 to 200 young adults gather at church every single Sunday night to praise God. That's strange. Like, that's weird and that's beautiful. And I'm just coming from a context that's not sanctuary. I'm so thankful and grateful to be here tonight and be speaking to you because this is really special. I think God looks down and smiles at this community. So I am so excited to be here with you tonight. Like Russ said, my name is Dan. I'm on staff here at BlackRock. I work on Sunday mornings, and so put way too simply, my job is to help new people get connected with BlackRock and help make sure that this is a welcoming environment for everyone joining us. And I know a lot of you guys don't know me, so I felt like I needed to introduce myself a little bit more. So some of the most important things that you need to know about me are, number one, that I never learned how to spell Wednesday until I was a senior in high school. At some point, it's just too late to ask how to spell it. It's really embarrassing. The second thing that you really need to know about me is that I'm allergic to the sun. That makes as little sense to you as it does to me. I don't get it. I get sneezing fits whenever I go outside, though. I'm like a vampire. It's bad. The third thing that you need to know about me is that I really, really, really love the smell of gasoline. I promise I'm not an arsonist. There we go. I wasn't expecting that reaction. And my wife told me just how weird I was for this earlier this week, but I like the smell of skunks. Is that weird? I got one. Thank you, Stefan. So after saying that, I understand if you just can't trust anything I say for the rest of the night. I think you're justified in that. But I'm standing strong to my convictions. And the very last thing that you need to know about me to understand who I am, and this is something I don't share with anyone. I was thinking about it this week, and I realized that I've been here for about a year, and I can count on my hand how many people know this about me. And I promise, as soon as I say it, you're never gonna be able to look at me the same way. I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, did he murder someone? It's worse. I was homeschooled. I love the support that I'm getting tonight. This is great. The reason I usually don't share that with people is because usually there's an image that comes to your mind when you think of someone who's homeschooled, right? You think of someone who's a little bit socially awkward, who's a little weird, and who's really obsessed with something really, really random. And that was the perfect description of me as a child. I was in my zone, and I'm not gonna lie to you, being homeschooled was awesome. I gotta wear PJs to class sometimes. The morning traffic from my bedroom to my dining room table never was too bad. My mom would take me on trips to different museums and different historical sites around Boston. And the best part of it all was I got to spend all the time in my day with my mom. And I freaking love my mom. So I'm not going to lie to you. I was in my zone. I was loving life until 6th grade. In 6th grade, my dad had a conversation with me. He said, son, next year, we're sending you off to school. And I broke down. I lost it. I was crying. I was weeping. I begged him. I said, I'll do anything you want. I'll wash your car every single week. I'll do the dishes forever. Don't worry about it. Just let me stay in my comfort zone. And he told me that I was still getting sent to school the next year. And looking back at it, one of the things that I was most stressed out about in that transition was I didn't know who I'd find when I went to a new school. I was worried about the relationships I would find. I was worried about the friendships that I'd encounter, and I didn't know how to manage those emotions. And looking back at it, that decision to send me to school was one of the best decisions that was ever made in my life. I made that first year of school, I met two of my very best friends in life who continue to be a huge part of my day-to-day life. They were both part of my wedding party a few years ago as well. And I grew more that year than I think I ever have the rest of my life. And all this is to say that what we're talking about tonight is the importance of friendship. The series that we've been in for the last 4 or 5 weeks is called Biblical Relationships. And we've been talking about how we relate to God and how we relate to one another on this earth. And so we've had a lot of great talks, a lot of great speakers who shared with us. And tonight I'm bringing it home by talking about what healthy biblical friendship looks like. And some of you guys are probably gonna think, well, I have a ton of friends, so I probably don't need to pay attention tonight. But the title of my talk is actually called Fake Friends. And what we're not talking about tonight is people that have hurt us or who have talked about about us behind our backs. But what we are talking about is the difference between acquaintances and friendships. So I think a lot of times you and I get confused and we think that we have a lot of friends, but in reality, we actually have a lot of acquaintances. So what an acquaintance is someone that we enjoy spending time with, someone we like hanging out with, someone we enjoy being around. Maybe we have the same hobbies or the same passions in life, but we kind of stick to a surface level kind of relationship with those people. So I think a lot of times we think that we have more of a community than we actually do. And I want to challenge you that the Bible shows a really deep image of what true healthy friendship looks like. And before we start, I want to preface this by saying the kind of friendship that the Bible describes, this kind of deep and deep friendship, you can only hold one or two of these types of friendships in your life. This is not something that you want to go out and try to find 60 of these people. What I'm describing is one or two people in your life that you want to find that you're going to start investing in. And if you don't, and maybe you're still not convinced why this is such an important topic, but having healthy friendships and learning how to be in healthy friendships is the basis to learning how to be in a healthy romantic relationship. It's the basis to learning how to be in a healthy marriage someday. It's the basis of learning how to be in a healthy parent and a healthy family member. And so a lot of what we're talking about tonight kind of transitions into a lot of those different areas. So I'm really excited to share with you. And this is one of those messages that has hit me as I've been preparing. I've been really convicted this week, and I've actually had to rethink some of the friendships in my own life. And so I hope that God speaks to you in the same way that he's been speaking to me. So in order to understand friendship, we're going to be diving into 1 Samuel. And we're going to be looking at the relationship between David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel. Now, this is one of the most popular as well as most famous friendships in the entire Bible. And it's the passage that a lot of people use in order to communicate what biblical friendship looks like. But we're going to be taking it from a little bit of a different angle tonight. Before we get too far in, I want to describe to you the different characters that we're going to find in the story. So first in the story, in our David and Jonathan friendship, we of course have David. Now, David, some of you have probably heard about, he later was the king over all of Israel, but when we find him in the story, he's growing up as a kid under King Saul. So King Saul is ruling over all of Israel, and David's growing up under his reign. And David is described in 1 Samuel as a shepherd boy, as the youngest of 8 brothers, and of someone who doesn't even look more prepared for leadership than his other brothers. Let that sink in for a minute. He didn't even look more prepared for leadership than his other brothers. And so God's choice of David as the next king wasn't based on accomplishments or family status or what he was able to do, but instead, God's choice of David was based on his radical humility and his intense reliance on God. And so that's David in the story. And David is gaining popularity as Saul is king. So David with the people of Israel is gaining popularity, is gaining power, is gaining influence while Saul is still king. So Saul is getting nervous about this. And then we're introduced to someone else in the story as well. Jonathan is introduced to us a little bit later. And Jonathan was the oldest son of Saul. So Jonathan was next in line for the throne. From his very birth, Jonathan would have been trained and educated and taught and prepared to lead the nation of Israel after his father Saul died. And so the image that we see is Saul as the king, David as someone rising in popularity, and Jonathan who's rising in popularity on the other end, right? So David and Jonathan are almost competing for the same throne. And we see every single reason to assume that David and Jonathan would have been bitter rivals. That they have more of a reason than anyone else on earth at the time to hate each other and to root for each other's downfall. But what we see in the story of 1 Samuel is a little bit different than that. And so through the rest of tonight, we're going to be looking at Jonathan and his pursuit of friendship with David. We're going to draw out 3 observations from that pursuit of friendship, and then we're going to apply it to our own lives. Does that sound good? Does that sound good? Nice. I love it. All right, so we're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 18 to start, and we're going to read verse 1. So it should be on the screen behind me. As soon as he finished speaking to Saul, that's David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So we're going to pause here really quick. Before we go any further, I want to make a big preface. It can be easy for some of us to read into the story, given the language and the vocabulary used, a 21st century mindset of this story. And we can hear certain words or we can hear certain vocabulary in the story and assume that there's something more going on in the story of David and Jonathan, that maybe there was something romantic. And before we go any further, I want to squash all of those thoughts. It's really clear biblically, it's really clear from many biblical scholars that David and Jonathan were just close friends and that there was nothing else going on. And so for anyone in this room who might be thinking, that's a weird way to talk about a friendship, the reason why the wording is so strong is because their bond of friendship really goes beyond what the language can even communicate. So we're going to continue to look back in the verse now. And verse 1 says, as soon as he finished speaking to Saul. So David is speaking to Saul shortly after David killed Goliath. So put yourself in David's shoes for a second. You single-handedly killed the most intimidating enemy your nation has ever faced. Good job. I'm proud of you. It's cool that I know you. So you kill Goliath, and Saul and all his advisors, including Jonathan, want to hear word for word everything that happened in that battle. They want to hear how God moved, how David moved, and what happened. So put yourself in David's shoes. What are you going to say to the king? I know what I would say. I would say, yeah, I'm pretty freaking awesome. You can call me Dan Giant Slayer from now on. My TV show airs next month. I'll get t-shirts in the mail next week. If you want an autograph, let me know. I'll be selling that after. But David handles the situation a little bit differently. David gives all glory and honor for his success to God in that conversation. David, in humility, points all the glory to God from his victory with Goliath. And so Jonathan, who's in the room and hearing what David is saying, understands that David has a strong relationship with God. And Jonathan is able to bond with him immediately, as we see in verse 1, because they're unified by their joint relationship with God. Jonathan loves God as number one priority in his life, and Jonathan hears that David also loves God as number one priority in his life. So this brings the first observation from Jonathan's pursuit of David in friendship, which is that Jonathan sees. Jonathan sees that David has a thriving relationship with God, and he prioritizes his friendship and relationship with David because of that relationship with God. And they can't begin to be such close friends until Jonathan knew about David's love of God. So for all you taking notes out there, this brings us to our first point, that acquaintances, people that we enjoy hanging out with, those people come through common interests. But biblical friendship comes through the foundation of a shared relationship. David and Jonathan are able to base their friendship off the one thing that is unchanging, the one thing that's more important than their jobs, that's more important than their future success, more important than whoever reigns over Israel as king. They build their friendship off of their personal relationship with God. And hear what I'm not saying in this. What I'm not saying is that all your acquaintances need to be Christian. What I'm not saying is that you should only be hanging out with people who believe the same things as you. In fact, I want to encourage you, you should have acquaintances that believe radically different things than you. You should have acquaintances that push you to grow, who have different stories than you. But those one or two David and Jonathan type relationships in your life should be formed on the foundation of having a shared relationship with God. And that brings us to the question of how can you and I see in our lives? How can we be like Jonathan and search out in our lives? Well, I think we do this really naturally. I think we naturally see other people all around us. But I think sometimes we value the wrong things when we look at other people and other possible friends. A story of this in my own life was when I was a freshman at college, I was in an orientation group. And I met this guy named, I'm not gonna say his name, but for this story, we'll call him Bill. Now, Bill was one of those guys that walks into the room and he just lights it up. He was someone everyone wants to be friends with, someone everyone wanted to be connected with, and that everyone felt special after having conversations with. And so I saw Bill and I said, out of everyone in my orientation group, you're my favorite, I wanna be friends with you. So I started going out to lunch with him, started going to the coffee shop with him, started hanging out around campus with him. And I got really disappointed after a few weeks because I noticed something strange. Every single time that we were out together getting food or getting coffee, he would prioritize making new acquaintances and collecting more friendships outside of our friendship. And so I walked away really disappointed after a few weeks because I realized that what he valued was collecting acquaintances, and what I valued was someone who I could walk through my college years with and pursue God with. And there wasn't anything wrong necessarily with what he did, but we both had different goals and values, and we had to separate what we were doing because we both were going in different directions. Jonathan never felt disappointed in his relationship with David in the way that I felt disappointed in my relationship with Bill. And the only healthy way that we can grow in biblical friendships is by prioritizing those who are in complete pursuit of God. We continue reading the story in verse 2. That says, "And Saul took him on that day," that's David, "and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul." I want to read verse 3 again because it is so important. It says, "Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul." As we already talked about, Jonathan has the most to lose from David's success, right? They're both going kind of after the same goal. Yet we see that Jonathan makes a covenant. Now, some of you out there are probably thinking, what the heck is a covenant? A covenant was something that was used back in the day as an unbreakable promise between two people. We see that God makes covenants with his people all through the Old Testament, and that those are unbreakable promises that he keeps to those people. And while this passage doesn't say specifically what the covenant that Jonathan made to David was about, many biblical scholars believe that the covenant was a covenant of friendship. So it would have been something like an unbreakable promise that Jonathan was making to David, saying that no matter what happens, no matter my success, no matter your success, no matter where you or I live, no matter how you annoy me, no matter how we grow as people, I will never stop prioritizing our relationship as my number 2 priority in my life. Number 1 is God, number 2 is my friend. So that's the promise that Jonathan makes to David. And this shows us our second observation from Jonathan's pursuit of David in friendship, which is that Jonathan swears. I have to be honest with you for a second. This would have been better as Jonathan commits, but all my other points started with S, so I feel like I had to do swears. So swears/commits. Jonathan promises that nothing, not even the power and importance of running the nation of Israel, could ever come between him and his friendship with David. And this isn't how you and I usually view friendships either. We usually view friendships as mutually beneficial relationships. That we surround ourselves with people who make us feel good, people who make us feel funny, people who we think that will boost our social credit. But very rarely do we commit fully to our friends without caring about what happens or what goes on. David and Jonathan's friendship was based on way more than just emotion. It was no matter what happens in our life, I'm committed to you as a priority, as number 2 in my life. And that brings us to our second point tonight, which is that true friendship is marked by unconditional commitment to your friends. Really quickly, before we move on, I want to make a note. If you're sitting here this evening, see how used to a Sunday morning church I am? If you're sitting here this morning, if you're sitting here this evening and you're saying, I don't think that I can trust my friends, and I don't think that I can commit to my friends, I don't think that would be wise for them, for me to trust them in that way, maybe you should reevaluate who you're putting in an influential position in your life. If you can't make a commitment like this to the people that you're surrounding yourselves with, it's a warning sign that you need to reevaluate who you're putting in that position in your life. I saw myself do the opposite of this in high school. I was incredibly self-conscious, and I realized maybe around sophomore year that I could just go to all my top 10 or 12 closest friends and call them my best friend. And when I called those people my best friend, I realized that they began to think of me a little bit differently, that they began to have a higher level of commitment towards me when I said words, even if I didn't back them up. So I didn't change how I was treating them, but I classified our relationship as something different. And that's the opposite of what we see here in David and Jonathan's relationship. That David and Jonathan are committed beyond anything that could happen to remain friends. So how can you apply committing to friendships in your own life? Well, as a staff, a couple months ago, we had an author share about his work with us, and his name was Rob, and he shared with us about his book on soul care. And a large part of what he shared with us was based on friendship. Something he shared that he did with his one or two David and Jonathan type relationships in his life was that he prioritized going on a retreat with those two relationships individually at least once. And the point of this retreat was not to rest, it wasn't to relax, it wasn't to spend time together, but the point of this retreat was to be fully accountable to the friends that he had in his life. He said that his goal was in those retreats to share 100% of his life with them, to share the beautiful things about his life, to share the good things about his life, to share the disgusting things about his life, to share the unconfessed sin in his life. And his goal was to walk away at the end of the weekend knowing that someone on earth fully knew him and yet was still fully committed to loving him. And what I'm not saying is to go out in the cafe after this and to share your entire life story with someone you just met. While that would be really entertaining for me, I don't think that would be a good life choice for you. But what I am saying is that this is a really good goal to shoot for. It's great to look at kind of the finish line of where your friendships can go, of you should strive for the level of commitment in your friendships, that you would be able to share everything with someone and that they would still be 100% committed to you and vice versa. My note in this section is that trust comes really, really slowly. In order to build trust, you have to start trusting by giving little and a little and a little to your friends. You can't start trusting by dumping your whole life on one person and expecting them to use that well. You have to start by little and see how the people around you use that. Do they throw it in your face? Do they bring it up when they're mad at you? Do they share your business with other people? You build trust by slow, repeated commitment. And now we continue reading in verse 4. And verse 4 said, "And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt." Finally, we see Jonathan give David his robe and the rest of his materials. Now, when I was reading this, I was like, what is this kind of robe? Is this a robe he bought at Walmart? Is this the robe that Jonathan stole from the Marriott from his stay the last week? And so in researching, I figured out that the robe that Jonathan gave to David was his royal robe. That we don't really have a comparison in our society and our culture to what this would have been like, but people would have been able to tell just by the robe that Jonathan was wearing exactly who he was, exactly how important he was, exactly what his life would have entailed to that moment, and what his future held. And so we see that Jonathan is giving essentially the equivalent of his crown for the throne to David in order to commit to their friendship. So again, we see Jonathan using the very thing that ought to separate them in order to commit to their own friendship. And that brings us to our third observation from Jonathan's pursuit of David. And that is that Jonathan sacrifices. Jonathan freely sacrificed his own goals, his own aspirations, and his own ambitions for his friend. Not only did Jonathan sacrifice when making the covenant, but Jonathan also makes a consistent effort to continue to sacrifice after first making the covenant with David. That brings us to a little bit later in the book of Samuel, in chapter 20, where Saul is seen screaming at Jonathan. He says, "As long as that son of Jesse," which is David, "lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." We see Saul screaming at Jonathan that as long as David lives on the earth, that he will never be king. And Jonathan knows that full well, but Jonathan still chooses to advocate for David in the presence of his father, to the point where he gets a spear thrown at him and almost gets killed by his own father for advocating for David in the presence of Saul. And why does Jonathan do all this? Because Jonathan places a larger value on David's well-being than his own. That sounds like a great friend. So that brings us to our question of how can you sacrifice? I think out of everything that we're talking about tonight, this is the easiest point to understand and the hardest one to apply. It's really difficult to learn to sacrifice for our friendships, but sacrifice can come in all shapes and sizes, but the core of sacrifice is giving up your own desires or needs for the benefit of those around you. That can mean giving up small things, big things, medium-sized things, but when we surround ourselves with the right people and we commit to loving them, sacrifice is how we continue to make sure that our relationships and friendships are healthy. Which brings us to our third point tonight, which is that consistent sacrifice is required in order to maintain biblical friendships. Something else that you need to know about me that I neglected to tell you at first is that one of my spiritual gifts is killing houseplants. I don't know how many of you are like that in here as well, but I am terrible at taking care of houseplants. But kind of how I like to view sacrifice and what helps me understand the importance of sacrifice is when you start to view your friendships as houseplants, sacrifice is the water that you use to feed those friendships. And there are some houseplants that can last months without being watered. There's some that can last weeks. There's some that can last days. But every single plant around your house that I would kill, you can maintain healthy by watering it. And when you neglect to water it, those things become withered, they become neglected, and they try to conserve energy, just like our friendships do when we don't sacrifice for them. Sacrifice almost acts like a deposit in your relational bank with your friends. And what I'm telling you tonight is that you're never going to find that David and Jonathan type of relationship and be able to maintain it until you get really, really comfortable sacrificing big things and small things for your friends. Because it's going to take a lot of work, it's going to take a lot of sacrifice, but the end product is completely worth it. At the end of the day, these friendships don't happen by accident. After hearing all this, you might be thinking, I really want a Jonathan. I really would love someone to come into my life who will see me pursue God, who will swear unconditional friendship to me, and who will be willing to sacrifice everything for me. That sounds like a really, really good friend. And I also would love a Jonathan. But my challenge for you tonight, Sanctuary, is to stop looking for a Jonathan. And instead that you would be a Jonathan and find a David for yourself. Now, what does that mean? That means that you would be willing to be on the lookout for other people who are pursuing God. That you would be willing to be on the lookout for other people who are prioritizing God in their own life. That you would be willing to start committing in friendship to them. And that you learn to sacrifice consistently for them. There's an assumption that everyone should sacrifice for us and that everyone should give up for us. But unfortunately, what we're unwilling to do for others is often exactly what we expect them to do for us. My brain works in a really, really weird way. If you can't tell that from tonight, talk to my wife. She'll tell you it is really strange. But in preparing for this message, I had the thought, I knew that I was going to encourage you guys to try to find a David in your own life. And then I started thinking, on Sunday morning and in Black Rock as a whole, I know like 10 or 12 Davids, and one of them sitting right there. Hi, David. And I was like, it's not a unique name. How many Davids must be in this community? And so I looked it up, and I've been like giggling and asking people all week how many Davids they think are in our community. People are like, oh, I think it's 10, I think it's 25. Do you know that there are 189 Davids in Black Rock? That's crazy. That's wild. That blows my mind. And the thing that blows my mind even more than that is that there are more figurative Davids out there than actual people named David. Now, what's a figurative David? A figurative David is someone who's ready to start a David and Jonathan type of relationship, but they're waiting on Jonathan to take the first step. So my encouragement for you tonight is that there are people in this room who are waiting to go into that kind of friendship, who are waiting for you to take the first step in that friendship. And every single week here, we encourage you after service, go hang out in the cafe. And what does that mean to some of you guys? It means sprint out of this room as quickly as I can so I can get in my car and go to McDonald's. Can I encourage you guys? You're not gonna make these friends by accident. So prioritize staying in the cafe, at least today, to make me happy. Prioritize in community time, going up to someone you don't know. Use it as an opportunity to see if you can find other people on fire for God. I truly think you're gonna be surprised by what you find. And at the end of the day, all of this is going to be worth it, because if you're able to find a David and Jonathan type of relationship, it's going to affect your entire life. All right, can I pray for us? Amazing. Lord Jesus, I thank you for this incredible community of young adults. I thank you that there are so many people here committed to gathering together to hear about your word, to worship you, and to praise you. This is not normal. This is such a cool thing that we get to be a part of, and I praise you and I bless you for it, Jesus. I pray that today we would be convicted to start these types of David and Jonathan's relationships with the people around us. I would pray that if we're already in a David and Jonathan type relationship, that we would be motivated to apply these principles in those friendships. That we would be able to be great friends, and that we would be able to model your love to the people around us. That it would make not only a difference on this earth, but it would make an eternal difference in the people that we invest in, Jesus. So I thank you, I praise you for the opportunity to be here, and I pray all this in your name. Amen.